The tank coughed, then died. It was before dawn on December 17, 1944. The air had a brittle edge, cold that creaked in the joints, boots that sounded louder than they should have. A gray light washed the low firs and the frost on the road. Joachim Peiper slid from the driver's hatch, gloved fingers searching for something that the gauges would not show. The engine was silent. The radio offered only static. He expected the usual: frozen fuel lines, a bent linkage, surrendered to the weather for an hour while a crew worked with hammers and old prayers. Instead, he found a sight that would haunt the rest of the month. Rows of metal cans lined the ditch like a town of tiny rusting houses. Jerry cans stacked in pallets, layer upon layer, as though someone had unloaded a truck and simply forgotten to stop. The smell, faint under the ice, was of oil and something sweeter. High-octane fuel meant to make tanks run hard and far. Men who had been saving volts and swearing over every mile suddenly moved with a different motion, less furtive and more electric. They opened cans, checked level caps, and passed them hand to hand. A paper, water stiff at the edges, showed a headline from an Allied newspaper folded on top of a crate. A printed manifest, yellowed but legible in the weak light, listed origins: refineries in Texas, quantities in barrels, a string of dates that did not add up for a man who had been told his country's stomach was empty. For Peiper and the men with him, the find was immediate salvation. For the wider German offensive in the Ardennes, it would be a painful proof, a piece of reality that contradicted the hope the plan had been built upon. No one, at first, believed him. That disbelief mattered. The Ardennes attack, launched in mid-December, was in many ways a bet that material shortages could be overcome by daring, by surprise, and by seizing the enemy's supplies. Planning documents assumed the offensive would capture Allied fuel and vehicles intact, replenishing German units as they pushed west. Yet by late 1944, the Wehrmacht was already operating on a precarious diet of synthetic fuel and strict allocations. Coal-to-liquids plants required time, and Allied air attacks and bombing campaigns had chipped at German refineries. High Command talked about shortages in the dry, bureaucratic language of rations, reduced allocations, prioritized deliveries to critical units, emergency pooling of fuel into a handful of spearhead formations. Tanks were told to run only for combat, engines were turned off on the roadside to save every drop. Orders circled through course: conserve, consolidate, capture. So when a junior commander returned to headquarters with a written note, manifest shown, cans counted, the paper proof of shipments headed towards Normandy, the reaction was immediate skepticism.
The idea that the Americans could be running on a near inexhaustible supply while German logistics sputtered seemed to many as fantastical as a winter sunrise in July. Hitler expected miracles, or at least the kind of miracles he could command. Field commanders were trained to interpret scarcity as the normal state of war. Reports that contradicted that frame threatened more than a plan. They threatened belief. Peiper's discovery, therefore, did two things at once. It relieved the men who could refuel right there in the ditch, and it posed, quietly, an existential question. What if the entire offensive had been designed under a false assumption about who would run out first? If the Ardennes would be decided by geology or by the valor of assault troops, then the moment he stood among those cans was merely a tactical curiosity. If the war would be decided by the factories and the pipelines, the engines and the fuel tanks, then that roadside cache was a small, blinding piece of a far larger picture. After the initial excitement, after the guttural cheers, the sloshing sounds, the hurried stripping of cans for the immediate need, Peiper did what commanders do. He cataloged. He photographed nothing. Photographs were not his task there. He wrote notes. He read the manifest. The shipping stencils and paperwork named ports and refineries, dates that showed fuel had crossed oceans in a matter of weeks. A well-printed uniform page, meant for clerks rather than frontline soldiers, had the cold clarity of industrial logistics: serial numbers of containers, delivery points, tonnages. To a soldier raised on ration cards, it looked like another language of abundance. Word of the find spread along the column. Some officers shrugged, allies leaving a few tins behind, one dismissed, imagining small, isolated caches. Others thought of scrap and sabotage. Perhaps the Americans had overstocked and then abandoned supplies in the panic that followed the initial German thrust. A few men, more practical than skeptical, simply wanted more. Another can here, another crate there, and were not concerned with what it meant for grand strategy. But the manifest carried an implication that could not be ignored. These supplies were not incidental. They were part of a deliberate, high-volume movement of fuel and material that had been flowing westward since D-Day. In the months after Normandy, Allied logistics systems had matured into a machine. Pipelines had been laid under the sea. Truck routes had been organized into round-the-clock convoys. Tons and gallons were being measured not in the language of ad hoc improvisation, but in the language of mass production. When the manifest listed origin cities in Texas, it anchored the front in a continental network: refineries, railheads, ports, assembly points. The war was not just fought on frozen roads and muddy fields. It was being fed from across an ocean. That realization traveled beyond the ditch. Peiper filed reports.
He spoke to men who could corroborate his notes. When his paper reached divisional staff, it became a rumor with attachments. When those attachments were read against other intelligence, intercepts, reconnaissance, the rumor hardened into evidence. What Peiper had stumbled upon in the ditch was the most human of proofs. Not a theory argued in a map room, but a pile of metal cans and a piece of paper that insisted on being read. It showed in microcosm the macro reality: American industrial reach and an Allied logistical strategy that turned production into presence, continuous and reliable. The importance of logistics in industrial warfare is not romantic. It is arithmetic and scheduling and weatherproofing. It is the narrowness of a gas cap and the breadth of a refinery. It is pipelines and fuel gauging and nights of loading tonnage onto ships in Virginia so that weeks later, tanks would not have to wait at a crossroads in Belgium. This arithmetic had been taught, warned about, argued over in German ministries for months. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, knew the limits and had been fighting a rearward battle to increase output. The German economy had shown resilience, but it had never matched American scale. Where the United States could draw on vast oil fields and a sprawling industrial base, Germany relied on synthetic processes and on a shipping network increasingly vulnerable to Allied interdiction. Understanding that contrast is key. By late 1944, Allied supply systems could move prodigious quantities of fuel forward. Pipelines like Pluto, the pipeline across the English Channel, mobile trucking operations such as the famous Red Ball Express, and sustained runs of merchant shipping and tanker traffic. The whole operation was ugly in its logistics: massive convoys, fuel pumped beneath the waves, supply dumps that grew into small cities of cans and drums. The American Army's daily consumption was matched by an industrial reach that produced petroleum and processed it into the fuel needed for armor, artillery, and aircraft. Germany's story, by contrast, read like scarcity memos. Synthetic petrol production could not be scaled overnight. Bombing campaigns had hit refineries, oil fields, and pipelines were vulnerable. Even as Speer pushed to restore output, the practical reality remained. Frontline units received fuel in strict parcels. Orders limited movement. Single-file roads to reduce wastage of petrol in idling engines, delayed offensives until fuel could be concentrated, careful rationing of jerry cans to units whose radios said the next supply might be days away. All of this filtered down into the daily life of the soldier. A panther on the move was a rolling promise of power, but that promise could be hollow if the barrel beneath the engine read empty. Tanks guzzled the stuff. Heavy German tanks were engines of appetite. In combat, fuel consumption surged.
A halt could mean that an assault faltered before it reached its objective. Sitting idle, engines cooled, but the die was cast. In the arithmetic of a campaign, the question was not whether a unit could break through, but whether it could keep moving once it had broken through. So for German planners, the takeaways mattered more than the isolated cache at Hansfeld. If the offensive assumed Allied supplies would be captured intact and thus sustain German advances, then the presence of Allied caches along advance routes both invalidated a key assumption and revealed that Allied logistics were not merely surviving, they were thriving. The Allied logistical system had several pillars. Pluto, an industrial feat in its own right, was not just a headline. It was a pipeline that meant fuel could flow directly from supply points in Britain to the continent without relying solely on tanker shipments. The Red Ball Express, staffed largely by African-American drivers and organized into a relentless 24-hour operation, kept the front fed with supplies. Ports, Cherbourg, Antwerp, when it could be used, served as nodes where tonnage flowed onto trucks and into distribution points. Every step reduced the friction between production and the tank track. These logistical arteries also gave the Allies strategic choices. They could afford to move, to rotate, to conduct operations requiring sustained fuel use, not simply short, sharp thrusts. They could also, when necessary, deny supplies rather than let them fall into enemy hands. That denial is another part of the story. The deliberate burning of depots, the destruction of stocks when there was greater certainty they could be denied to the Germans. For the Allies, burning their own fuel was an ugly arithmetic but a strategic choice. Better to destroy than to allow an enemy to refuel an offensive that might cut deeper into Allied lines. Back in Peiper's column, as the morning light strengthened, men took the edge off exhaustion and scratched their pens where the manifest suggested future questions. A junior non-commissioned officer looked at the list of origin points, ports on the American Gulf, and muttered what several had already started to say. This was not a stray convoy. It was the tail of an industrial creature that had been fed for months. He named no one. He did not need to. The manifest spoke. Those closer to staff work took different notes. Logistics officers, who live in a world of tonnages and timetables, began to do the mental math. Each can represented more than a few liters of fuel. Each manifest was part of a chain. If refineries in the United States could ship thousands of barrels westward, if pipelines and convoys could deliver them close to the fighting lines, then the balance of supply was not a level playing field between equals. It was an asymmetry. This asymmetry can be expressed in numbers with the bluntness of finance.
Allied petroleum production and access to worldwide reserves dwarfed access capability. Where the United States had access to vast fields and to a production apparatus built on peacetime industry scaled to wartime needs, Germany's access to liquid fuel was measured in the tens of millions of barrels annually. Those numbers do not need to be arithmetic for the soldier in the ditch. They need to be translated into movement, how far a tank can go, whether an armored spearhead can sustain itself on the second day, whether the column that seeks to encircle will find the hydraulic fluid and gasoline to power the encirclement. Peiper's find did not immediately produce that arithmetic at the highest levels. It produced a report, a paper, and then, as reports do, a need, verification. That is where the story takes its first institutional turn. A commander on the ground can bring back evidence, staffs can file it, ministerial offices can note it with disinterest. But when the evidence confronts a doctrine or an assumption, the machinery of decision-making must either adapt or ignore. In the days after the find at Hansfeld, the German command structure displayed both tendencies. Some at corps and division level began to reappraise tactical timelines. Thinned columns might have to wait. Objectives might be scaled back. Others, bound by the urgency of orders and the imperative of following the plan, held to the original timetable, convinced that the captured cans were an exception rather than a rule. Above them was a political and military leadership that preferred certainty and coherence to inconvenient truth. When Speer and other ministers tried to impress upon the Führer the limits of production, Hitler often answered with directives that assumed miracle, seizing Antwerp, a quick decisive blow, not the arithmetic of supply, but the politics of will. The result was cognitive dissonance. On one hand, frontline evidence, Peiper's manifest among it, suggested a logistical story in which Allied abundance was a decisive factor. On the other, a leadership culture that had built its campaign on the expectation of capturing Allied supplies remained committed to a timetable that did not allow for systematic supply failures. That mismatch would prove lethal. Meanwhile, the Allies, for their part, were not unaware of the stakes. Their logistics planners had spent months building redundancy into the system. They had industrial redundancy at home, they had supply lines across the sea, and crucially, they understood that those lines themselves were a target. Convoys had escorts, depots were dispersed when possible, and engineers were trained to make hard choices, among them the decision to destroy rather than give the enemy a prize. It is in that moral and practical gray area that some of the most decisive acts of the Ardennes would take place. To burn an Allied fuel dump is to remove a resource from both sides.
It is also to acknowledge the ability of the enemy to take it if left intact. Those fires, images of black smoke curling against the gray sky, photographs taken for the record, would later circulate through reports and headlines. For a commander in a ditch, they would be proof that the other side possessed the means and the will to deny as well as to supply, complicating the simple picture of capture as resupply. Peiper, in subsequent interrogations, and in the reports that would be examined by interrogators and historians, became the human vector of this larger truth. He had been the one to open the cans, to read the manifest, to report the provenance of supplies that had, in the minds of many in German high command, been scarce commodities to be won on the battlefield. In a war that had often been described in terms of heroic thrusts and tactical brilliance, his discovery demanded a different narrative, one where the victory is measured in barrels and delivery timetables as much as in kilometers taken. But even as the manifest worked its way into the files, even as staff officers calculated and recalculated, disbelief lingered. There was an institutional habit, perhaps a human one, to lean on the plan rather than to let plan bend to new fact. Dispatches that documented the fuel situation were often contradicted by hope. The highest levels of command clung to the possibility that once the offensive reached certain crossroads, the tactical picture would change and enemy supplies would be captured. That hope was not irrational in every sense. It reflected a long-standing military logic. Take supply depots and the enemy withers. There was, however, a stubborn difference between hopeful assumptions and the arithmetic on the ground. A captured depot does not always equal sufficient supply. Tanks need consistent, sustained flow, not just an afternoon of fuel. And the American system, scalable and redundant, often meant that empty cans at the edge of a road were not the whole of the story. They were symptoms. As the column pressed on from Hansfield, the implications of the find began to ripple. Men who had been starving for movement found temporary relief, and commanders who had been told to conserve felt the tug of new constraints. Could they push harder now? Could they rely on such discoveries further down the road? As with many appeals to miracle, the answers were provisional. By the evening of December 17, the small human drama at the ditch had been transcribed into a thread within a larger tapestry. War diaries would note the find, a few officers would mention manifests and later interrogations, historians would reconstruct the event as a hinge between frontline perception and strategic truth. For now, the men washed their hands of diesel in cold hands, and the tanks, for a time, had the gift of motion. Yet the gift was partial. There was no refueling convoy following behind with the wholesale supplies required to sustain a major push.
There was only the cruel arithmetic of what could be carried, what could be seized, and what would be burned rather than allowed to be taken. When Peiper filed his report, it did not land into neutral air. It entered a nervous ecosystem of intelligence, rumor, and denial. The signal it sent was as simple as it was damning. The enemy could feed itself on a scale that German production could not match. Whether that signal would be heard, believed, or acted upon was another, more human question. In the days that followed, other signs began to accumulate beyond the ditch. Reconnaissance photographs showed lines of Allied trucks moving through towns almost casually, a continuous ribbon of supply rather than an occasional convoy. Local reports whispered of fuel dumps, some unattended, some deliberately left in vulnerable positions because nearby supply routes made their capture unlikely. Newspapers printed headlines that bureaucrats had not expected the front to read. Stars and Stripes would run accounts of pipeline capacity and of tonnage moved that, when folded and placed with the manifest, formed a paper trail from Texas refinery to Belgian roadside. Still, in the warm rooms of high command, the initial reaction could be summed up as incredulity. Leaders who had to make decisions on faith and order remained reluctant to recalibrate an entire campaign on the basis of pockets of evidence. Their view of the front was not just operational, it was psychological. To accept that the enemy could sustain itself while one's own supply base faltered was to admit that the rules had changed. That admission would carry consequences for strategy, for pride, and for blame. Peiper's story, at once small and embarrassingly large, thus entered the treacherous zone between anecdote and evidence. A captain on a December morning had found paper and cans. His report demanded verification. What would verify it were documents, photographs, supply manifests from ports, and eventually the dramatic, undeniable images of fuel burning when Allied engineers set entire depots ablaze to deny them to German hands. Those images, and the manifest copies that would be captured and catalogued, would do what words from a ditch could not. They would present to a skeptical high command the cold, bureaucratic proof that American logistics were operating on a scale Germany could no longer match. But that moment, when skepticism became acceptance, was still ahead. For now, the war in the Ardennes moved on with its mixture of hope, urgency, and human miscalculation. Peiper's men would drive on with their portion of stolen motion. The tanks would roar for a time on captured gasoline,
and the column would still follow the timetable set by orders drafted before the facts at the ditch existed. If the narrative arc of the offensive had been a straight line, the Hansfeld cache was a sudden detour that demanded recalculation.
Instead, the effort continued, a procession of metal and men bound to an agenda whose assumptions were now under question. The immediate tactical advantage of fuel in the hands of Peiper's unit did not instantly translate into strategic advantage for the entire offensive. Supplies captured by one column did not equilibrate the systemic shortages suffered across the German war economy. In the corridor of higher decisions, meanwhile, other voices were louder. There were reports from frontline units asking for fuel, for ammunition, for replacements, each a demand on a shrinking store. There were messages from ministers reporting the plight of the war economy and replies that invoked the necessity and glory of following through. The gap between what the manifest at Hansfeld showed and what ministry figures could deliver widened into a gulf of strategic consequences. Peiper's initial disbelief, how his paper would be read, doubted, and finally checked, illustrates a recurring pattern in wartime. Information that threatens to overturn a narrative requires not just data, but a convergence of sources before it forces policy change. Manifests needed corroboration, photographs needed captions and validation, newspapers needed to be read alongside shipping logs. That bureaucratic process, slow by necessity, would determine the speed at which the German command could adjust. So the scene froze, in a sense, a soldier among stacked jerry cans, a manifest listing Texas origins, a command structure at once supplied with statistics and reluctant to change its course. The men drank their fill and drove while they could. The question of whether their grasp would be enough to carry the offensive remained open. And in distant rooms of planning and production, other actors continued to move their pieces. Allied engineers prepared contingency plans to destroy supplies rather than let them be used. Logistics staffs in London and the ports kept running the numbers. Ministers like Speer tried to squeeze more from a system already stretched. None of them, in that early December week, could see the whole board at once. But the board itself, its lines of supply and its reservoirs of fuel, was the theater in which the Ardennes would be decided, not merely the trench and the hill. It was into that complex, cold arithmetic that Peiper's paper had dropped like a pebble into a dark pond. The ripple would widen, but the first waves were still small, indistinct against the larger swell of plans and orders. The manifest could not compel change. It could only insist upon being read. Whether those who read it would alter their maps was a human question as much as a logistical one. For the men in the ditch, the manifest meant motion. For the offices beyond, it represented a troubling possibility that the offensive might be built on assumptions now at odds with reality. The hours passed, the tanks rolled, and the fighting intensified. The manifest in the cans remained a quiet, persistent datum in a campaign otherwise dominated by speed, shock, and the raw will of commanders. If you want to follow the logistics thread through its full arc, how pipelines, trucking networks, and deliberate denial of supplies shaped the Ardennes and the wider war, subscribe for the deeper series on wartime logistics. Sources and archival photos are in the description below. As orders continued to move down the chain, the question of how high those manifest notes would reach lingered. Would a single report from a ditch force a revision of a campaign, or would it be swallowed by the momentum of decisions already set in motion? The answer lay in the documents yet to be found, the photographs yet to be taken, and the conversations yet to be had in rooms where strategy and fact would finally have to agree. In the next days, other pieces of evidence began to surface, some accidental, some deliberate. Patrol reports detailed abandoned vehicles whose tanks read empty. Intelligence intercepts hinted at Allied movements that suggested operational strength. Photographs captured ribbons of trucks that the naked eye might have mistaken for a small traffic jam, but that when counted and catalogued became an unstoppable logistical river. The manifest from Hansfeld was no longer an isolated curiosity. It was a thread that, when pulled, threatened to unravel more than a single plan. But at that moment, on the cold morning after the engine died, the future was still a set of choices. Men warmed their hands over small fires. The manifest lay folded in a pocket. The tanks pushed on when they could. Decisions at higher levels remained stubbornly attached to previous assumptions, and the war, for the moment, continued to be fought both by men with rifles and by men who managed the invisible flows of fuel and production that powered them. Other signs arrived, and they came in documents and pictures that could not easily be set aside as hope or rumor. Photographs from reconnaissance flights showed what a single eye might have dismissed as a long, ordinary convoy.
Counted and dated, those trucks added up to weeks of sustained supply. Intercepted radio traffic, logged in the margins of staff notebooks, hinted at pipeline repairs and tanker schedules. Stars and Stripes ran statistics, tonnage moved, pipeline capacity increased, that when folded and compared with Peiper's manifest, formed a paper trail stretching from refinery to frontline. The first unmistakable institutional proof did not appear in the noisy hubbub of the front lines. It arrived in quiet files, captured manifests, port logs, and the clipped bureaucratic language of engineering reports. One captured manifest recorded a shipment's origin not in an anonymous southern refinery, but in specific Gulf ports and Texas refineries. A port ledger showed tanker arrivals and dates that matched the numbers on the manifest.
An engineering report from the Royal Navy and the British Electrical Corps documented Pluto's throughput in barrels per day, figures that, by processing through supply tables, translated directly into the capacity to maintain armored formations on the move. Those documents had weight not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. War is often claimed in rhetoric. Logistics claims itself in tallies. Each number reduced an argument of faith, we will capture what we need, to a question of arithmetic. How many gallons were available? How many miles could a convoy cover in a winter storm? How many tanks could be kept in motion if fuel flowed reliably from port to dump? The Allies understood that they could not risk allowing German units to harvest their logistical gardens. Where supply could not be physically protected, it had to be denied. That was the grim calculus behind the orders issued to engineers and depot commanders in the weeks after the offensive began, when the choice was between a depot falling largely intact into German hands and its destruction. The answer became clear: burn it. The decision was neither cavalier nor heroic. It was a preventative strategy grounded in an understanding that fuel, like ammunition, is a decisive resource. Photographs taken by Allied units show the resulting black plumes. Scenes of Stavelot and nearby supply dumps, barrels, drums, and stacks of jerry cans caught fire, and photographs later cataloged as evidence. The images are coercive in their simplicity: rows of containers, tongues of flame, columns of smoke. They are also proof that the Allies possessed not only the capacity to move enormous quantities of fuel, but that they also had the means and will to deny that capacity if necessary. For German leaders who had already received Peiper's report, the images forced a reckoning. Staff officers circulated copies of photographs alongside the manifest from Hansfeld. A war diary entry noted long waits at refueling points and empty gauges on heavy tanks. Interrogation summaries recorded how captured soldiers, some bewildered, some resigned, described the shock of finding Allied towns with stacked supplies like small marketplaces. A later interrogation of a logistics officer paraphrased his admission: "We had assumed we would feed on the enemy. The records showed otherwise." Still, cognitive inertia runs deep in military organizations. Plans are made to be executed. Orders have a momentum of their own. High command, always wary of admitting error to itself, slowed its adaptation. Field commanders argued for flexibility. Political leaders demanded progress. Only when evidence accumulated in multiple forms, manifests, photographs, engineer reports, and headlines, did skepticism start to shift towards acceptance.
Albert Speer's reports, circulated in the corridors of the Reich, told the story of an economy that could not, without months or significant change, replicate the flow that now moved through the Allied system. His memos and the ministry's internal correspondence focused on repair, on shifting scarce resources to high-priority plants, on an impossible race to restore lost capacity. Speer knew the arithmetic of factories. He also knew that production lines could not be speeded up by will alone. The gap between what could be produced at home and what the enemy could import by sea was not just strategic, it was structural. Field Marshal Model and other frontline commanders were less interested in abstract production arguments than in kilometers and hours. Their reports to headquarters began to include entries that were clinical in tone and cataclysmic in implication. Immobilized columns due to fuel shortages, tanks abandoned with hatches open and keys still in the ignition, artillery batteries that had to unlimber and wait for rationed fuel that never came. These were not anecdotes. They built a pattern. There are recorded instances, staff notes and interrogation summaries, that capture the tone of disbelief turning to a reluctant understanding. One divisional diary entry records an officer's note after inspecting a captured depot. Not enough for one division, but indicative of a system. Another staff report, forwarded to the Oberkommando, included photographs and a terse line. Manifests attached. Possible sustained supply from Western ports.
The word possible in such correspondence carried the entire burden of converting rumor into accepted fact. Yet even as the documentation piled up, there were other, darker dimensions of the Ardennes that could not be reduced to statistics. The offensive, bold and brutal, produced crimes that have no arithmetic and require moral clarity. The Malmedy massacre, an atrocity in which American prisoners were executed after capture, stands as a stark reminder that scarcity, defeat, or fear do not justify criminal acts. War crimes were committed, recorded by survivors and investigators, and those acts are, in historical judgment, unequivocal crimes. Any logistical explanation for battlefield conditions must remain separate from the moral indictment of such deeds. They were crimes, and they were treated as such by tribunals and by the record. Meanwhile, the tactical consequences of the supply imbalance became more immediately visible in the physical landscape. Columns stalled along narrow Ardennes routes. Villages saw the sudden appearance of abandoned armor. Puddles and tracks froze hard around hulks whose fuel tanks read empty. Practical details: how many miles a Panther could travel in a full tank, how many gallons a Tiger burned in a day of combat, how many lorries the Red Ball Express could haul in a given shift, moved from technical tables into desperate conversation at company and battalion level.
The arithmetic of movement finally matched the arithmetic of production. The German offensive made valiant local pushes and achieved tactical surprises in places, but the inability to maintain momentum without predictable refueling points meant that breakthroughs could not be exploited. Armored formations that punched a hole could not always stretch that hole into strategic advantage. The limbs of the offensive withered when fuel was not forthcoming. Where logistics were consistent, the Allies could absorb shocks and rotate units. Where logistics faltered, a local success became an isolated victory with no capacity to be reinforced or followed through. Allied logistics did not simply allow them to move, they allowed them to make hard choices. The decision to burn depots rather than risk their capture was one such choice. In places where engineers set alight tanks of fuel, they also left photographs and reports indicating both the tactical reasoning and the scale of the stocks destroyed. Those images, published in periodicals and filed in military archives, served as undeniable evidence. When German commanders were shown those photographs, alongside manifests that tracked origin ports and dates, the case that Peiper's capture of Hansfeld was not an isolated fluke became overwhelmingly convincing. The human side of acceptance is never neat. Some officers, when confronted with stacks of paperwork and images, rationalized sections of the data as anomalies. Others recalculated. A general staff meeting, reconstructed from post-war interrogations, described a tone of disbelief, followed by the grudging recognition that sustaining an offensive indefinitely without a secure supply base was not feasible. One wartime memo, cited in several post-war reports, recommended prioritizing fuel delivery to specific sectors. The memo's logic was a tacit concession that the offensive scope might need to be reduced. As December moved onward, the material consequences became brutal and visible. Aerial reconnaissance logged the steady lines of Allied supply convoys moving through Belgium and into captured ports. Local police and civilian reports noted the sudden appearance of American trucks in towns that German units expected to resupply from. Men at the front wrote home of Americans throwing away fuel or stacks of cans beside the road, accounts tinged with frustration and disbelief at the enemy's apparent resources. Those accounts were not always accurate in detail, but when paired with the manifest evidence and the photographs of burning depots, they created a mosaic that could not be dismissed. The German High Command, long accustomed to treating reports from the front as colored by local conditions, found itself forced toward a national-level conclusion. The enemy possessed a logistical depth that Germany could no longer contest on equal terms. The effect on morale is hard to quantify, but easy to see.
For frontline troops who had been taught that capturing supplies would alleviate shortages, the sight of enemy depots either intact but unreachable or destroyed by their own owners was a steady erosion of faith. Propaganda that promised miraculous resupply by seizing Allied stores collided with the sight of empty gauges and smoking, blackened drums. The psychological impact rippled upward, diminishing belief in the campaign's sustainability, increasing doubts about the veracity of assurances coming from higher command.
By Christmas, the offensive's momentum had dissipated. The combination of hard attrition, weather, and above all, the inability to secure adequate and continuous fuel supplies had halted the advance. Abandoned tanks peppered the roads, monuments to a campaign whose seams had been opened by logistics. A tiger captured intact in a town would later be exhibited in a museum with its fuel gauge permanently frozen at empty. That museum display, curated decades later, would be accompanied by interpretive signage explaining the supply arithmetic of the winter campaign, the image of a proud machine with an empty stomach. The archival record tells the remainder of the story in a manner that a single frontline discovery could not on its own. Investigators cataloged captured papers and cross-referenced them with Allied shipping records. Engineers' reports on Pluto's throughput were matched to depot-level inventories. Stars and Stripes articles, along with port logs from Cherbourg and Antwerp, formed a public and private ledger of Allied logistical capacity. Taken together, these disparate materials confirmed a central conclusion. The superiority of Allied production and the reliability of their supply chains had a decisive effect on the Ardennes campaign. Historians and staff officers later distilled that lesson into a summary that is blunt in its logic. An attack that assumes the enemy's supplies will be captured must also assume the possibility that those supplies will be absent, dispersed, or destroyed. The German planners had not fully accounted for the Allied capacity to project logistics and to deny those same resources when necessary. Peiper's manifest and the stacks of jerrycans at Hansfeld were the human and visual proof of this miscalculation. They were small, quotidian artifacts that illuminated a far larger systemic imbalance. Accountability, too, has its record. Post-war interrogations and trials examined actions and commands. The Malmedy massacre and other crimes were tried and judged. They remain moral and legal facts in any account of the campaign. For those who study logistics, the ethical questions about deliberate destruction, burning one's own fuel to deny it to the enemy, sit alongside legal and tactical questions. The Allies' decisions to destroy stores were choices made within a calculus of greater strategic preservation, but they also produced immediate hardship and risk to civilians and soldiers alike.
Historiography treats both the arithmetic and the ethics with care. In the months that followed, German military planners and political leaders were forced to confront what Peiper's paper had implied. The battlefield had become a theater not just of tactics, but of industrial capacity. Speer's ministry kept feeding numbers into requests for priority allocations, but the capacity to meet those needs had been diminished by bombing, lack of raw materials, and the overwhelming scale of Allied access to foreign oil. The confirmation of those limits, expressed in captured documents and in photographic proof, replaced conjecture with a stark calculus that could no longer be politely ignored. Retrospective accounts by participants, paraphrased in interrogations and histories, convey a common sense of belated understanding. Officers who had once discounted reports of Allied abundance later admitted that the weight of evidence had been convincing. "We could no longer plead ignorance," a staff officer paraphrased in a post-war summary reported. The admission was not dramatic. It was the quiet acceptance that, on balance, the enemy's capacity to sustain itself at scale had been decisive. The physical remnants of that reality remain in museums and archives. Tanks abandoned in Belgium, catalogued in after-action reports, tell a tale of machines deprived of the one thing that makes them offensive instruments. Manifests and shipping logs, now digitized in some collections, show route after route of fuel's westward journey. Photographs of black smoke and charred drums record the tactical choices, harsh, sometimes tragic, that shaped the campaign's fluid geography. Peiper's small act of reporting, taking the manifest, counting the cans, filing the paper, had in its moment the quality of an inconvenient truth. No one had fabricated the evidence at his feet. What he found was tangible and actionable, but it needed corroboration in other forms before the highest levels would change course. That pattern is instructive beyond the winter of 1944. In war, in policy, in any system where belief and assumption can override fact, physical evidence and cross-verified records are the mechanisms by which reality forces adaptation. The conclusion of the Ardennes episode is not a single dramatic pronouncement, but a composite of outcomes. The offensive failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Men died and crimes were committed. The front line shifted but did not break in the fashion intended by German command. Yet the more lasting historical lesson is structural. Industrial scale and logistics underwrote modern warfare in a way single acts of bravery could not overcome indefinitely.
Production lines, pipelines, convoys, and the willingness to deny supplies when necessary combined to make the Allied advantage operationally decisive.
Peiper's war story, ridiculed at first in quiet rooms where plans were sacred, found its vindication in documents, photographs, and the hard calculus of supply. The manifest from Hansfeld, once fodder for rumor, became one among many pieces of evidence that proved a systemic point. The enemy possessed a logistical depth Germany could not match. In a museum years later, visitors would stand before a preserved tank with its fuel gauge forever stopped at empty, and a plaque would explain in concise terms how numbers and supply chains shaped the winter campaign. The plaque would not narrate the individual human drama of that morning in December. It would point to the broader lesson. Victory in industrial war depends on the steady flow of materiel as much as on tactical daring. And yet, for those who study the campaign, the human detail endures. A commander stepping out into cold light, a row of jerry cans like a town of 10, a folded manifest that tied a roadside scene to refineries across an ocean. No one believed his war story at first. That disbelief was human, bureaucratic, and partly cultural, rooted in the habits of command and the stubbornness of plans. But documents do not answer to belief. Manifests, photographs, and engineering tables answer to verification. When those materials were assembled, the story Peiper carried became undeniably true. The evidence finally appeared, and with it came the sober historical judgment. In the Ardennes, as in the larger war, the arithmetic of production and logistics proved decisive. If you want to explore these documents and photographs directly, a curated list of primary sources and museum exhibits is available in the description. Visit the archives or the exhibits to see the manifests, the photos of burning depots, and the tanks whose empty gauges tell the rest of the tale. Share this episode with someone who cares about how modern war is waged, by men with maps, by ministers with production goals, and by the quiet, persistent movement of fuel across an ocean that ultimately ran a campaign.